A storm is building on every front, and the world is holding its breath. Ukraine is escalating its response with powerful new weapons as breakthrough systems quietly enter real combat for the first time. On the front line, the situation is shifting faster than ever. Ukrainian forces maneuver, Russian units stumble, and key cities reveal the truth behind enemy propaganda. Meanwhile, political shockwaves ripple far beyond the battlefield. In Washington, a deepened split changes President Trump's wartime agenda, reshaping US policy toward Ukraine. Europe sends its own unmistakable signal, and the stakes for Kyiv have never been higher. All the details in our special edition of Hotspot. A decisive and uncompromising response to the attacks on Ukrainian territory is now underway. President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has confirmed that Ukraine is deploying its own SAPSAN ballistic missiles in real combat. And that's not the only breakthrough. The advanced Flamingo missile platform is joining Ukraine's arsenal, bringing long-range, high-precision strike capability to a new level. All the details in our full report.
SAPSAN in action. The Ukrainian armed forces have begun using domestically produced ballistic missiles to strike the enemy. The exact specifications of the SAPSAN missile are not disclosed, but its deployment by Ukrainian forces will allow them to hit enemy targets, possibly even more effectively than with the use of ATAK-MS. Ukrainian missiles have twice the explosive power, fly faster, and have a much greater range.
What is the exceptional advantage of using the SAPSAN operational tactical missile system? That is its use against targets on the territory of the Russian Federation, even primarily on the territory of the Russian Federation, as well as against legitimate military targets in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine, is an exclusive sovereign right of the Ukrainian side itself.
In addition to the SAPSAN, the Ukrainian army is using several other domestically produced missiles against the aggressor country. This was stated by the President of Ukraine.
He says that the Ukrainian side, despite the intensity of strikes on defense industry enterprises, has managed not only to preserve the infrastructure of its defense industry, but also to increase and scale up the production of its own weapons. This indicates A, the presence of qualified engineering personnel, and B, sufficient funding for Ukrainian defense industry enterprises, which are capable of scaling up the production of Ukrainian-made weapons. Virtually all Ukrainian weapons are made exclusively from Ukrainian components.
Let us recall that in September of this year, Volodymyr Zelenskyy stated that Ukraine is actively developing long-range weaponry. He said that the test was successful and the next stage is the launch of mass production. Earlier, Ukraine began production of Flamingo cruise missiles with a range of up to 3,000 kilometers. On Friday, December 5th, the company Firepoint delivered another batch of cruise missiles to the Ukrainian military. Also in November, the armed forces of Ukraine attacked important targets on Russian territory. Long Neptune missiles were used for the strikes. Another of the most important developments has been drone missiles such as Palyanitsia, Peklo, Ruta, and Bars.
The Ukrainian side is ready to scale up and deploy its own strike capabilities across the territory of the Russian Federation. They were referring to the SAPSAN and accordingly the Flamingo. In addition, Ukraine's defense forces have scaled up the production of strike drones with a target range of over 1,500 kilometers.
The armed forces of Ukraine are successfully striking military targets in the Russian Federation, and oil refineries are also in the crosshairs of drone systems.
It was precisely the use of Ukrainian strike capabilities that has effectively blocked the operation of about 40% of Russian oil refineries. According to the Russian side itself, the losses to the Russian budget are estimated at around 100 billion US dollars. But it should be noted that the Ukrainian side does not intend to stop at the results already achieved.
Since the start of the full-scale war, Ukraine has ramped up weapons production and the implementation of new technologies, which are already being used at the front. The volume of domestic weapons production has increased by dozens of times. Thanks to private companies, Ukraine will be able to create innovations in the defense industry and effectively implement them on the battlefield.
Starting next year, the Ukrainian defense industry and Ukraine's defense forces will receive Ukrainian ballistic missiles with a target range of about 800 kilometers. It should be noted that the manufacturing company claims to have developed two ballistic missiles with a range of up to 200 and respectively up to 800 kilometers.
All this means that Ukrainian developers have demonstrated the ability to create high-precision weapons that destroy important enemy military targets deep behind the lines.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine today. Join us now.
What is happening right now on the front line and far beyond it is unfolding with renewed intensity. The situation is shifting by the hour, new threats are emerging and new opportunities are taking shape. Ukrainian forces are carrying out complex operations, the enemy is attempting to regroup, and international partners are increasing pressure on Russia while expanding their support for Ukraine. A full picture of the battlefield dynamics and developments capable of changing the course of events in our comprehensive report.
Siversk has not been captured, although the situation in the city is difficult. The Operational Command East has denied Russian fake reports about the capture of the city. Meanwhile, the Deep State Project reported that Russian occupation forces have intensified their attempts to advance in the Siversk area of Donetsk region. According to experts, the enemy continues to amass infantry near the settlement. The situation also remains difficult in the Pokrovsk area. However, our command reports that the situation has nevertheless improved. The Russian advance has slowed significantly and the enemy has lost part of its logistical routes.
The maneuvers carried out by our fighters, which stabilized the front, including getting out of a difficult situation in the areas of Suky Yar and Lysivka, have today leveled the front line. That is clear today. The Russians have not managed to change anything drastically, despite the enormous efforts the enemy is making today to try to advance both in the city center and accordingly into the northern districts of Pokrovsk. However, they have not succeeded in doing so.
At the same time, a number of analysts report the effective encirclement of neighboring Mirnorad. According to open sources, the defense forces did have to abandon some positions. However, the occupiers closed the ring. They still can't.
And accordingly, as a direct consequence of the preceding circumstances and the various factors that had been at play, the highly anticipated and much discussed event known as the Cauldron ultimately did not materialize. It failed to come to fruition, thereby altering the expected course of events and leaving a significant void where a pivotal occurrence was once foreseen.
Kupensk. The successes in Sutam have reached such a scale that they cannot be ignored. Even the Z warriors have arrived. In particular, it is reported that Russian troops in the city have already been cut off from the crossing over the Oskol River to the north, through which supplies are delivered.
This raises the question, how did Gerasimov's report on the capture of Kupiansk affect the situation? Usually such things have the most negative impact. After lying to the higher-ups, the command on the ground is forced to make reality match the reports, regardless of losses or reasonable necessity.
On the contrary, the Ukrainian command does acknowledge some successes by the Russian Federation in the Kharkiv region, particularly in Vovchansk. In
Vovchansk, there the enemy also managed to advance a little through the ruins that Vovchansk itself is in today. Obviously, I assume that most likely the pressure in this direction may be increased. However, Russian losses today, and let's say the Russian units that are in this direction, have somewhat run out of steam. And
on the southern front of the country, the front line has finally been stabilized. The alarming news that had been coming from the positions in Zaporizhzhia and Dnipropetrovsk regions in recent weeks seems to have come to an end. The reserves that arrived in these directions have accomplished their task. They have tied down the Russian assault units.
today, Ukrainian defense forces managed to improve their tactical positions on the Zaporizhzhia front and in the Dnipropetrovsk region. We are not naming the locations today, but our forces have made progress forward. Accordingly, these counter-attacking actions are preventing them. This result, that the Russian army is losing momentum, is evident, but again, we expect them to reinforce with reserves.
At the same time, analysts note that in recent months, amid Russia's desperate assaults, more and more footage is appearing online. Videos from Russian positions where they openly talk about the price paid to take control of this or that area, or another forest plantation.
There's no rotation, no food, we drink from puddles. Once every 3 days. Water doesn't get through, food doesn't get through. The guys are dying. In a month, more than 50 people have already been killed or wounded. People, if you hear this video or know about it, please help. They're sending us to slaughter. The commanders don't even consider us human.
Well, maybe this will finally reach those who are still thinking about joining the ranks of the Russian armed forces. Because for Russian contract soldiers, there simply isn't any other fate.
Ukraine's defense forces retain firm control over most of Kupiansk, with Ukrainian units operating in the western, eastern, and even parts of the southern districts. Russia's statements about supposedly capturing the city are pure propaganda with no basis in reality. The key facts and frontline updates right ahead.
Another resounding victory for Putin, at least in words.
Comrades, the armed forces of the Russian Federation are confidently maintaining the initiative and continue to carry out the objectives of the special military operation.
The enemy has been claiming the complete capture of Kupiansk in the Kharkiv region and the alleged encirclement of 15 battalions of Ukrainian defense forces in the city since the beginning of December, notes the Ukrainian Center for Countering Disinformation.
In fact, in order to fuel this information psychological special operation, let's call it Kupiansk, it is clear that the Russians have already involved the so-called top officials of their state. This includes citizen Gerasimov, who calls himself the chief of the general staff of the armed forces of the Russian Federation. Accordingly, this is at least one of the Putins who is also participating in this kind of information psychological operation. And accordingly, we can see that even some Western media outlets are getting involved, reporting on the complete encirclement of Kupiansk on its total capture. Moreover, these are quite reputable publications.
The claims made by the Russians are also refuted by the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, Oleksandr Syrsky, who added that Ukrainian troops have managed to significantly improve their tactical position directly in Kupiansk. At the moment, a successful counter-sabotage operation is ongoing in the city aimed at eliminating the enemy, of whom only a few dozen remain there.
It is obvious that the Russians have not managed to achieve such significant successes on the battlefield. Despite the fierce fighting and despite the fact that the grouping of Russian troops operating from the Sever-Slobozhansky direction all the way to the Crimean front, the intensity of combat operations today is extremely high. However, even after concentrating massive forces in the Pokrovsk-Mirnorod direction and in other hotspots on our front, including the Kupiansk direction, they are not achieving success. Obviously, they need to show that all these efforts by the Russian troops are firstly producing results. The result is positive. The advance is rapid, and this information needs to be conveyed to our European partners as much as possible to show them Ukraine's weakness and accordingly the strength of the Russian army.
According to the operational situation, as of the morning of December 10th in the Kupiansk direction, our defenders repelled assault actions by the occupiers towards Petropavlivka and Bohuslavka.
Today we can say that the enemy has been pushed back to the northern outskirts of the city of Kupiansk itself, from where they entered, and those positions, which sometimes change hands 5, 6, or even more times, are now under the control of the defense forces. A counter-sabotage operation is underway today. In other words, we are essentially talking about clearing certain sectors of the city of Kupiansk of Russian troops in order to try to completely push the Russians out of the city.
Nevertheless, the Russians continue to shell the Kupiansk area with glide bombs, while Ukrainian rescuers evacuate the local population under fire.
The evacuation continues, carried out by the relevant army units and police forces, and it will continue. People need to be taken out of Kupiansk, because this is a mandatory evacuation, and it really must be an evacuation. Civilians in this situation cannot interfere with the defense forces. We have seen how this ends, particularly in Kupiansk itself. Remember the situation when the Russians actively used civilian clothing to disguise themselves, infiltrate the city center, carry out their so-called flash mobs, flag plantings, and most importantly, try to advance further into our positions.
Those who still decide to stay in the city are openly not welcoming to the occupiers and give them a direct response.
Tell the invaders to immediately leave our territory. Understood? And not to come back permanently ever.
A man without any fear tells the occupiers who have slipped into his building entrance to mind their own country and recalls how Ukrainian soldiers used to share their food with him.
Donald Trump has once again thrust himself into a debate no one invited him to, this time questioning whether Ukraine should hold elections during wartime. President Zelenskyy signaled that he is prepared for such a step, but Europe quickly pushed back. The European Union reaffirmed that Zelenskyy remains Ukraine's legitimate, democratically elected leader, and Western partners stressed that no elections can be held until wartime conditions make them safe and feasible. We break down the implications in our upcoming report.
The 47th president of the superpower United States has once again spouted nonsense. In a new interview with Politico, Donald Trump not only surprised with his knowledge of geography, but also openly indulged Russian desires. This is not the first time Trump has voiced the wish to hold presidential elections in Ukraine. Moreover, this issue was raised at the very beginning of the 45-minute interview.
Yes, I think so. A lot of time has passed and things are not going very well. Yes, I believe the time has come. I think now is an important moment to hold elections. They are using the war as an excuse not to hold elections. But I think the Ukrainian people should have that choice. And maybe Zelenskyy would... But they haven't had elections for a very long time. You know, they talk about democracy, but at some point it stops being a democracy.
In fact, analysts say that Donald Trump played into the hands of the Russian dictator Putin, who constantly accuses the Ukrainian authorities of being illegitimate. The Kremlin has repeatedly demanded that Kyiv hold elections. According to Moscow, only then is there someone to sign ceasefire documents with. In Moscow's version, there is someone to sign ceasefire documents with. At the moment, the Russians, through American envoys, are only pushing a capitulation plan. The question about elections caught Volodymyr Zelenskyy in the UK between meetings with partners. The Ukrainian president admitted to journalists that he is ready to amend national legislation and hold elections during martial law in the country, on the condition that the Americans and Europeans provide the necessary security for this. Why?
Is Trump threatening us with elections, but Putin is not? Again, we are ready for elections. Why should we be afraid of them? And you, Donald Trump, guarantee that not a single missile will hit here. Can you guarantee that while the elections are taking place, no one will attack us? Or will 30,000 people have to sit in basements for a week or even 2 because Russia is shelling us? Look at the train station in Fastiv. The states say we held elections during the war. Well, yes, when the war was in Europe and Britain. On their own territory, when there was war, the states never held any elections.
According to analysts, the issue of security is the most important one that the Ukrainian authorities should raise with their partners. In addition, how can transparency of the will of the people be ensured not only under constant shelling, but also in conditions of power outages? In Europe, they were quick to remind Trump that he is forgetting the context, while in Brussels, they understand what Russia is doing right next to them.
We have already drawn attention to this issue because these are exceptional times now. In my view, President Zelenskyy is a democratically elected leader, and any elections should be held when conditions allow for it.
Analysts note that for Donald Trump, this is the last real chance to jump on the bandwagon and force Kyiv to sign an agreement with Moscow.
Right now is the last moment when the entire active political class is on vacation, but starting from January, the marathon race will already be heading into the final stretch in the fall. In other words, there won't really be a summer break. No one will have time for that. Ukraine only comes up in between news reports about someone being trampled in a supermarket on Black Friday and, say, the Christmas tree lighting at Rockefeller Center. Trump is trying to squeeze as much as possible out of December and prevent this issue from resurfacing in January, when journalists and politicians return. And in January, Trump will start to be cornered into a course of action.
In fact, according to experts, Ukrainians need to hold out until the election race fully engulfs politicians across the ocean. And only then might the issues of aid and a just peace find more support.
A political upheaval is brewing in the United States. Public opinion polls show that Americans do not support Donald Trump's approach to the war in Ukraine. The Senate is also pushing back against several of the president's controversial decisions. And more than that, even Secretary of State Marco Rubio is attempting to pursue a pro-Ukrainian line within the framework of the ongoing peace negotiations. More on this in our report.
Chicago, Los Angeles, New York, Boston, in dozens of cities across the United States, mass demonstrations took place against the peace plan proposed by Washington, which, according to participants, effectively legitimizes Russian aggression and forces Ukraine to accept Moscow's terms. The American political establishment, which opposes Trump's policies, also joined the mass protests. For example, in Chicago, Congressman Michael Quigley joined the protests.
When authoritarian regimes try to erase an entire people, the world has no right to remain silent. We cannot repeat the mistakes of the past, and we cannot allow Trump to force Ukraine to accept a false peace dictated by Moscow.
Americans are very dissatisfied with Trump's policy toward Ukraine. If the 47th President of the United States began his second term in office with the support of 47% of the population, then due to the peace agreement, or more precisely the de facto capitulation of Ukraine, which the White House is trying to force Zelenskyy to sign, Trump's approval rating has dropped to a historic low. It's not just ordinary Americans who are dissatisfied with the peace plan. The agreement has sparked significant resistance in the Senate from both Republicans and Democrats.
Putin has spent the entire year trying to make President Trump look like a fool. If administration officials are more concerned with appeasing Putin than achieving real peace, then the president should find new advisors.
This capitulation agreement is unacceptable for America, for Europe, and for Ukraine. It was written by Putin and benefits only him.
Trump constantly threatens that the US will withdraw from the negotiations if a peace treaty is not signed in the near future. But in reality, he cannot do this at least until the US midterm elections for the House of Representatives and the Senate in November 2026. Because his approval rating is falling and his support is declining, which means Trump won't dare to anger voters even more.
He has already damaged his relationship with part of his own audience, the so-called MAGA movement leaders, over the Epstein Files case and the scandals surrounding their publication. Accordingly, if he now announces that he is completely washing his hands of Ukraine and forgetting about it, he will ruin his relationship with conservative Republicans, traditional conservative Republicans, who, although they remain silent, still have quite a significant influence within his own party.
Trump wants peace agreements and wants all the glory for himself. And anything that doesn't bring him personal benefit doesn't interest the president. In turn, Secretary of State Marco Rubio stated in a recent interview that he holds a pro-Ukrainian position in the negotiations and assured that Ukraine has good prospects and that a peace agreement will not be signed without security guarantees.
Theoretically, if everything is done right, in 10 years, Ukraine's GDP could surpass Russia's GDP. The following things are needed: stop the war, ensure that they are never invaded or attacked again, protect Ukraine's long-term sovereignty and independence, and make sure they do not become a puppet state. They are truly independent and sovereign, allowing their economy not just to recover, but to thrive and turn it into a story of prosperity.
Ordinary Americans are taking to the streets in protest, and senators and congressmen are already openly expressing their disagreement with a peace deal. Even Trump's closest circle is against making concessions to Moscow. Meanwhile, the 47th president is talking about the need to hold elections in Ukraine. But if he doesn't listen to those around him, he himself might not make it to the end of his presidential term in the US.
At this moment, that's all from me, Maria Farafonova. Even more hellish Frontline news in our next episode. But for now, don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. See you soon!